Hello, and welcome to the third panel of 9/11 in Asia, 2 decades later, our virtual conference marking the official launch of Diplomat Risk Intelligence, and that is the Diplomat Magazine's research and consulting division. This panel is focused on China. We'll be talking about how 9/11 shaped regional counter-terror postures and foreign policies enacted by the Chinese government. You can be sure to check out our other panels as well. They'll be exploring similar questions for Central Asia and Southeast Asia. We are very excited to have 3 well-known experts joining our panel today. First, we have Sheena Chestnut Greitens, an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and she also directs UT's Asia Policy Program. We have Yoon Sun as well, who is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia Program and director of the China Program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. And we are also pleased to be joined by Dr. Wang Zhen, who is a research professor of international studies at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and currently director of the International Security Studies program at the SAS Institute of China Studies. So again, thank you all for joining us from your diverse time zones. We're very pleased to have you with us today. We are going to start with Dr. Wang. I would like you to give us a brief outline of how China has approached counterterrorism since the 9/11 attacks. What legal framework has China adopted, and what governing philosophy is it using to approach the terrorism issue?
It's my turn. Okay, thank you, Ms. Chair. Thanks for having me in this panel. It's my great honor to share my personal ideas on this topic. Frankly speaking, I'm not an expert on the law science, but I will try to share my ideas on these issues. Generally speaking, before 9/11, I think China did not have a special counter-terror law. It's the counter-terror work mainly relies on relevant provisions in other laws, such as 1997 criminal law, which has some provisions in Article 120, and also the implementation rules of the National Security Law of 1994, which stipulates the terrorist activities that endangering the national security. After 9/11, China is trying to accelerate its counter-terror legislation. During this period, there were two main laws related to the counter-terror work. The first is the Criminal Law Amendment 3, which was passed after 9/11, 2001. It introduced the crime of terrorist activities. We don't have this before. And second is the anti-money laundering law, which was passed in 2006. In October 2011, the Standing Committee of NPC, we call the National People's Congress, passed the resolution on issues concerning strengthening anti-terrorism work. This was just a legal document. It's not a real law. But it's, for the first time, it defined the terrorist crimes, including what is terrorism, terrorist activities, terrorist organizations, and so on. And also stipulated the function of various government agencies in counter-terror work. This is also for the first time. And in December 2015, the Standing Committee of the NPC formally passed the anti-terrorism law of TRC. This was a former legislation and providing the main legal basis for China's current counter-terror work. Well, in addition to the counter-terror laws, there are also several other related laws which were used by the law enforcement. For example, the criminal law and the national security law and the regulations on religious affairs, which was passed by the State Council, etc. Some provinces and cities have their local regulations based on these laws. For example, Xinjiang, they have their own regulations on the religious affairs. They have their regulations on the de-radicalizations, etc. This is mainly counter-terror legal framework for China we're using now. But basically, China's counter-terror work is not just limited on the law enforcement, or we call how to say, criminal works. Usually people or officials usually trying to understand it in a more broad dimension or in a broad way. So with regard to the China governing philosophy or the counter-terror concept, I think three things need to be mentioned here. The first is to eradicate the social basis that breeds terrorism through government-supported development. It just takes Xinjiang as an example. I think most people, because very concerned about Xinjiang. In the 2013, the poverty population in southern Xinjiang reached 2.6 million, accounting for the 90% of the total poverty population in the Xinjiang, in the whole region. But by the end of 2019, the number of poor people in southern Xinjiang had dropped to 166,000, with the poverty incidence rate declining from 29.1% to 2.2%. And the government played a very important role in this process. For example, the general fiscal revenue of Xinjiang was about 434 billion RMB, Chinese dollars, in 2019, of which 332.7 billion were transferred from the central government, directed as a subsidy to the local government. So with the help, we can see, with the help of different government programs, many young people, the young guys who had been unemployed for a long time and lacked education background began to find a job now. The second is to emphasize the preventive counter-terror policy. This policy includes the national identity education for school students in the compulsory stage, but also several governance, legal, and professional education. Through the systematic education rather than punishment measures, the unfavorable social atmosphere in many places have been reversed effectively, and the right conditions have been created for the advancement of modern healthy governance. Just to give you an example, years ago, if a girl with fashionable dress walked on street in some areas, she would likely be insulted by some hooligans or extremists who would laugh at, spit out, or even beat her. But now there's no such anymore. I just have been there this summer. The third aspect, or the third point, is to mobilize the masses to eradicate the hiding places of terrorists through the so-called people of the war. We call it 人民战争, the people of the war. So all the terrorists are only a few in number in the entire society, but they often incite and hijack other people to fulfill their unlawful demands. In China's counter-terror struggle, the government attached great importance to mobilizing the masses. This policy had proved very successful in counter-terror campaigns. For example, in the summer of 2017, in the Houtian, the southern city in Xinjiang, more than 20,000 people participated in hunting for terrorist groups, just several terrorists. Most of the people joining spontaneously, not organized by the officials. So I'm not saying China's approach is far from, I'm not saying China's approach is very perfect. It definitely has a disadvantage to other things, and its reproducibility has yet to be tested by time, but it has relatively effective and based on China's national condition at the present. So in this regard, I think it deserves more research, not just criticized, whether it's from the academic or in the public. So I think I will stop here and look forward to the comments and the questions. Thanks for your attention. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Deng. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more to talk about regarding Xinjiang specifically when we move into the moderated discussion. But for now, I would like to have Sheena take over the discussion. We know that laws are a means to an end. They are tools that the government uses to reach its desired goal. So we also need to explore what those goals are that China is trying to reach through its counterterrorism policies, both domestic political goals and foreign policy goals. And I'd like to invite Sheena to help us bring that piece into the discussion as well.
First of all, let me echo my co-panelists just by saying thank you very much for convening this discussion, and that I look forward to the questions and the discussion to follow. My remarks today are mostly based, and my answer to your question is based in part on some research that I've been doing recently for a book project on how China thinks about national security and what that means for China's domestic security and its foreign security policies. And so I think counterterrorism is a very, very interesting and important piece of this story. So, and I would also say that I think we need to think about China's approach to counterterrorism, especially in the last 10 years or so, as pretty deeply embedded in and entwined with Xi Jinping's broader conceptualization of national security and the way that he has organized and in many cases reorganized the party state to address the way that he believes the party state needs to think about and grapple with questions of national security. And that's very much not the same as the way that the United States uses national security in our foreign or defense policy discourse. The concept means something different, and I think that that's important to note. But counterterrorism has always played a pretty central role in this idea of comprehensive national security and the comprehensive national security concept that has developed and become a template for a lot of security work under Xi Jinping. The comprehensive national security concept and China's inaugural national security strategy were developed and promulgated over the course of a little over a year, 2014 and 2015, during which time Xi Jinping also made a visit to Xinjiang, and there were a couple of fairly high-profile incidents that occurred that may have shaped his thinking. And the response to the promulgation of this national security framework and concept has been to really overhaul a lot of the way that the party state deals with national security. A raft of about somewhere between, I don't know, 18 and 25 new laws, depending on how relevant you see certain provisions, for example, in criminal law, changes to China's domestic and external security budget, an organizational restructuring that has to do with both the elevation of the discipline and supervision apparatus and the creation of a central national security commission, a party body that is designed to sort of better coordinate China's national security work. And so I think it's important to understand just that there's been a fairly thorough overhaul during the last 20 years, but really focused in the last 8 or 10 years on redesigning China's approach to national security, and that has a lot of really important consequences for both internal security policy and behavior and the external dimensions of security policy. Let me explain a couple of things about how the national security concept is a little bit different than what we would commonly hear or mean by a reference to national security in the American context. And then I'll talk about how that applies specifically to China's approach to counterterrorism. First of all, the central national security concept has a much, much larger role for internal security. Some of the writing on the concept explicitly says, we're supposed to consider internal and external security equally, but also that the center of gravity for national security work is really internal. And at the core of this idea of national security, it's a comprehensive national security concept with about a dozen different wide-ranging components. But at the core is a concept of political security, which really has to do with protecting the leadership of the Central Committee with Xi Jinping at the core, protecting China's socialist system and protecting the role of the party in China's political system. And so I think it's important to understand this partly as an internal and regime security concept, and again, to differentiate that a bit from American conceptualizations of national security, which are not necessarily tied to the political fortune of a particular party within the United States. The second thing is that the concept really sees internal and external security as very closely related. And in the words of some of the commentaries that I've been reading, sees internal and external threats as potentially interacting and reinforcing or affecting each other. And so in previous work, some co-authors and I have written about the fact that we think this came into play in counterterrorism policy pretty early, where China's escalation of repression and the expansion of mass detention facilities in Xinjiang appears to have been driven not just by these developments in Xinjiang itself that I talked about before, or even events that were internal to China, but some of the trends and developments that the party state was watching overseas, in particular, some of the movement of and participation of small numbers of Uyghurs in militant groups and fighting in Syria and the broader Middle East. And that a concern that that would produce reverse diffusion back into China that could destabilize Xinjiang and destabilize China more broadly played a pretty significant role in the timing of this decision around the expansion of detention and re-education facilities on a really collective and very broad scale. The final area is one that my colleague already mentioned, which is the idea of preventive security. And I think this is also really important to understand when we think about counterterrorism policy and events in Xinjiang in particular, which is Xinjiang often being described as sort of the main front line of China's struggle against counterterrorism. Some of the dominant metaphors are often medical. It's the language of inoculation and vaccination, which I'm sure we've all spent much more time in the last year and a half thinking about than maybe we did when that metaphor first appeared. But one of the things that suggests is that by definition, you are inoculating or treating people before they're symptomatic. And before they might have done any engaged in any actual behavior or manifested any symptoms of political illness, to use the metaphor that's a political virus that's sometimes employed. And that poses some real problems for the standard of proportionality, the way that it's typically defined in international law. That's one of the reasons why we've seen some very sort of broad-based concern from some of the UN's human rights rapporteurs and human rights voices who've expressed concern largely about the proportionality of the scale of detention and re-education in Xinjiang. A couple of final comments, because I know I'm coming up on my time here. The relationship between security and development, I think, has become a bit more complicated than it was in previous sort of years, particularly as it relates to Xinjiang. So for a long time, the party operated on the belief that development would eventually produce security, but sometimes now we see Xi Jinping describing these things more like the two wheels of a cart, or things that must operate in tandem. So yes, development assists security, but security is also a precondition for effective development. And I think that, again, that's really important for understanding why the party has chosen to embark on a more sort of securitized approach in areas where there is a perceived security threat like Xinjiang. I also do think this has some real implications for Afghanistan, which I won't touch on here, but maybe we can get to in the discussion. I know you all have another panel on Afghanistan itself, but insofar as it touches on China's counterterrorism policy, maybe we can discuss that a bit. And so I'll bracket that for a moment and hopefully return to that in the discussion. The final point that I wanted to make is that by almost every indication that we can glean as outside observers, the party state views this, its approach in Xinjiang, as having been successful. And the metric that the authorities seem to be using for success is no major incidents in the last 5 years, no major incidents in the last 6 years. That's not the only way we could define success, right? You could express some concern that the rise in surveillance and tighter political control might lead to preference falsification. So things look better for now, but you're getting a long-term accumulation of concealed dissatisfaction that could eventually produce a cascade, like happened in the Soviet Union. There are some other ways that you might think about success, maybe the external diplomatic and global criticism that's been applied to China's policies. But the metric that seems to be a consistent area of focus is, well, there have not been major attacks in X number of years. The policy is successful by that standard. And based on that as the chief metric, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see any course change by the party state in its counterterrorism policies, or particularly in terms of the domestic security aspect. I haven't touched on a whole range of other counterterrorism activities, such as military exercises in Central Asia and the Middle East and North Africa, where I do think China's had a corresponding more proactive approach to that in foreign policy. But I know that my colleagues are going to have some things to say about that. So again, I'll stop here and perhaps we can pick up on a couple of those threads in the discussion. Again, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sheena. There's plenty of food for thought for us already, and I'm excited to continue our discussion. And right now, we're going to move to Yoon, who's going to address some of these issues that Sheena sort of previewed for us. The rapid takeover by the Taliban of Afghanistan has driven home the international aspect of counterterrorism, particularly since we're marking the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, sort of the genesis of the global war on terror, which were, of course, were planned on Afghan soil. So Yoon, in the context of what we're seeing in Afghanistan, I'd like to have you talk about China's approach to transnational terrorism and some of its counterterrorism cooperation abroad, which again, Sheena already very briefly previewed for us.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. It's a true pleasure, and I have learned a great deal from the comments from the previous two panelists. I think the issue that both Sheena and Professor Wang raised about the relationship between economic development and security is a fascinating one, because in my work, I have been thinking about the relationship between these two concepts. In the Chinese example, China would say that, well, with development, there is going to be stability. When people have to go to work at 8 in the morning and don't get back to home until 6 in the evening, their chance and their time they have to think about terrorism or attacks will be significantly limited. But as I deepen my study on China's relationship with neighboring countries, especially unstable and the failed states on China's periphery, I find that the relationship between development and security is not only not binary, it's also not absolute. If you think about it, with development, stability is not guaranteed. And without development, instability is not guaranteed either. So I find it very difficult to draw a linear conclusion that with one condition, the other one must follow, because in the end, it's very much depending on the case that we're talking about. So for example, using the social engineering concept and use China-Pakistan economic corridor as an example, one of the rationale for the CPEC originally was to achieve the stabilization effect through economic development. And the idea is that if China infuses Pakistan with infrastructure projects and create jobs and creates more social, for example, social welfare and benefits, then presumably the internal stability will improve in Pakistan, and the terrorist attacks or the terrorist activities would be mitigated in that case. However, if we look at what has happened in the past, say 6-7 years since the CPEC was launched, I find it very difficult to draw that conclusion that this social engineering impact is successful. because at least this theory, I think, suffers from two fundamental and endogenous weaknesses. The first one is, well, when we talk about Pakistan or Afghanistan, we're talking about fragile states. We're talking about failed states. We're talking about states that do not have sufficient capacity to begin with to deal with these type of terrorist activities. So what has happened with the massive infusion of Chinese financing and Chinese projects is that the state has been forced to allocate already thin resources to protect the Chinese assets and protect the Chinese projects. And one argument has been made that this inevitably affects the recipient state's capability to deal with the security situation at home, because they only have this many troops and this much resources. And the more they allocate toward, for example, the Chinese Gwadar port in the Balochistan, the less they will have to deal with domestic terrorism. That's the first weakness, or the intrinsic weakness of this argument. The second one is, the second weakness is really the intensification of domestic conflict or domestic problems because of the Chinese infusion of projects and of financing. And we have seen this in the past 4 months in the case of Pakistan. From April to July, there were a total of 4 terrorist attacks targeting Chinese assets and Chinese nationals in the country. And the primary motivation for these attacks is because the oppositions who resent the Pakistani government's cooperation with China are aimed at sabotaging these cooperative efforts. And in China, we have the term that inequality rather than scarcity is a problem. So, for example, in the case of Pakistan, when the Chinese infusion of infrastructure projects and financing favors certain province in the east side, on the east side, and at the same time neglects the provinces on the west side, it inevitably creates resentment from the local populations. So that is to say that I think economic development needs to be structured and planned carefully, because otherwise it could also lead to the undesirable situation that instead of creating stability, it actually intensifies the instability. So coming back to the China's counter-CT policy overseas, I'll share some brief thoughts. The first one is that most of the Chinese overseas counterterrorism efforts have happened under one framework, and that is international CT cooperation. Because China follows the non-interference principle, and also there is this there's also a tradition in China that China does not station troops outside the Chinese border. It is extremely difficult for China to conduct counterterrorism operations outside the Chinese border independently. So therefore, most of the overseas counterterrorism activities we see China engaged in have been achieved through bilateral or multilateral channels. For multilateral channels, I think Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a pretty good example. And from the Chinese perspective, SCO's CT efforts primarily focuses on the three evil forces that are operating in Central Asia and having a tremendous impact over the stability and security of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So under SCO, there is a dedicated regional counterterrorism mechanism, which is focused on the counterterrorism cooperation among the member countries. Some of the concrete actions that we have seen coming out of this mechanism include regional counterterrorism exercise. So for example, this past March, SCO had announced that SCO member states are going to have a 2021 counterterrorism joint military exercise, which I don't think has happened, but it should be in the cards. And other cooperations have included, for example, the investigation and termination of funding channels of terrorism within the region. There's also joint counter-narcotics operations, because we know the narcotics have a deep tie with terrorist activities. And more recently, there is also the discussion about using travelers' information system jointly to prevent the entry or transit of foreign militants through member countries. And a large portion of this cooperation is focused on information or intelligence sharing. So that's on the multilateral channel. I think this SCO is a sterling example. But the bilateral cooperation is probably more striking in terms of the implications and the activities that have happened, because they inevitably relates to the issue of China's overseas law enforcement capability, and also the issue of extraterritoriality. For example, in Afghanistan, under the previous Ghani government, China had cooperation with Afghanistan government on counterterrorism. In fact, as early as 2012, Karzai had committed to counterterrorism cooperation with China when he was visiting Beijing in June. And at the same year, Zhou Yongkang, the former security czar of the Chinese government, visited Afghanistan and signed an agreement that where China will train, sponsor, and also equipped Afghan police. So it didn't specify, that agreement didn't specify what exactly China was providing, but the framework was very much laid in place, and activities and funding did follow. Then more recently in 2018, the Afghan Ministry of Defense has expressed has made a statement that Afghanistan was going to build a military base in Badakhshan province, which borders China through the Wakhan corridor, which is the most important shared border between China and Afghanistan. And the Afghan government also commented that China was going to provide weapons, equipments, and also uniforms for the military. And at that point, it raised a great question as for whether China would be sending some of its own military personnel to this military base, even just for training purpose. But the foundation for this base has been counterterrorism. There's a curious question as for whether out of the counterterrorism activities or cooperation that China has had received the acknowledgement or received the permission from the recipient government. So for example, last December, there was this very strange news reports out of Afghanistan about Afghanistan's intelligence agencies arresting 10 Chinese intelligence personnel in Afghanistan. And it was also reported that, that these 10 Chinese nationals were operating in Afghanistan, seeking information about Al-Qaeda and also Uyghur cells in eastern provinces of Afghanistan. So I think this report has some credibility because of the fact that Afghan officials from intelligence agencies at that point came out to say, well, this indeed happened. But we also did not hear a follow-up story as for what happened to the 10 people. Presumably they were sent back to China, but it does raise a lot of questions and skepticism about China's unilateral counterterrorism, intelligence collection, and even operations outside its border. Similar actions also happened in Southeast Asia. We know that currently there is a 4-country Mekong River joint law enforcement campaign among China, Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand. And this originated from the killing of 13 Chinese ship crews on the Mekong River back in 2011. So when China was going after the culprit of that Mekong tragedy, the Chinese law enforcement agencies cooperated with the governments of the 3 countries and arrested the Nokang who was responsible for that killing in 6 months. But at that time, back in 2011, 2012, Chinese law enforcement indeed crossed the border into Laos, into Thailand, and into Myanmar, and entered the Golden Triangle in order to go after Nokang. So even in the case of Myanmar and Laos, China also used the drones to pursue the criminal. This is not a counterterrorism case, but it is an interesting case in terms of the extraterritoriality of the Chinese law enforcement. And of course, I think among all the countries that China has counterterrorism cooperation, two countries really stand out. The first one is Pakistan, because of the terrorist attacks that I have mentioned earlier. And the second country is actually Israel, because Chinese government, Chinese intelligence agencies have been admiring Israel's counterterrorism capability, and that they have reached out to seek Israel's assistance and Israel's help when China was organizing large activities such as the Beijing Olympics and the Shanghai Expo. So I think there have been quite a great deal of substantive cooperation between China and Israel. In fact, counterterrorism is listed as a sterling example for the bilateral relations. So I think that pretty much offers an overview of China's approach to CT overseas. There's multilateral approach, there's bilateral cooperation, but there's also the curious question of unilateral actions by China. So still, by the end of the day, I think China is still at the early stage of building its overseas counterterrorism capability. And what will happen, what will ensue, we will see. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoon. I know it's hard to give a comprehensive overview of China's counterterrorism activities abroad in such a short time, but I really appreciate how thorough your remarks were. I think as we move into our discussion, one of the central questions that we need to address is the balance between human rights and counterterrorism. And this is an issue that every country is struggling with. There's been lots of debate in the United States and Europe, as well as in the Asia-Pacific. And this is essentially the point of criticism that the West has for China, which is that its policies have gone too far towards eradicating terrorism at the expense of human rights. As Sheena pointed out, China considers its policy a great success. It has essentially eradicated terrorism in Xinjiang because there have been no attacks in the last 5 or 6 years. But in the West, the cost for this success in terms of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of movement and interaction with other people, that cost would be considered prohibitive. And I think this is the central tension that we need to deal with. So first, I'd like to ask Dr. Wang to chime in and give us some insight on how the Chinese government views this balance between counterterrorism and human rights. Oh, you're muted, Dr. Wang.
Oh, it's okay. I want to respond with the points. The first is that, we have so different culture, tradition, and the social system. I have stayed in the United States. I know that you're very different from here. And I grew up here, so I'm also familiar with China. Just to give you one example, because to counter the pandemic, the coronavirus. So in China, where the face mask is not a problem, the people are very easy to accept. But in the United States, it's not so easy because some friends, they don't want to use it. That's so different. We have to accept the difference. This is the first thing. It's not about good or wrong, good or bad or right or wrong. It's about their tradition and their culture. It's very different. It's one thing. Another thing that is, the function or the main purpose of the China's anti-terror law is to provide regulation for China's counter-terror work. Actually, we have discussed after 9/11, some people against, but some support. But anyway, the government accept. So we have a new law on that. The main purpose is to provide regulation for the work, because people, they don't know how to do it. Now we have a law. It has a definition of what is terrorism, what is the terrorist activities, and how to do it, what's the function of the different government agencies, these and other things. And another point is that about the security and the development. I just give you one example. In the 2016, I did some field work in the southern Xinjiang, in the Kashgar, because they have a very heavy terrorist, a very bad, terrible terrorist activity that just happened. And because of the terrorist incidents, most businessmen, they didn't go to there to buy the agriculture products, for example, the walnuts, the raisins, something else. So the price, the agriculture products, the price are very low. The farmers are very hard that year, because without the security, there's no investment, there's no business. So it's difficult for there to develop, and people, they don't want to travel there. Agriculture and tourism is the main economy sector there. So with the influence of the bad terrorist act very so much, but now things are much better. So for here, our understanding of the human rights and security is totally very different. But the government did a lot, try to do something. But of course, we could not guarantee all the work is according to the law. But basically, we did a lot, and most of the work is on the track of the law. It's by the law. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I think you raised an important point, which is that China defines human rights oftentimes in terms of economic rights. Prosperity and development is seen as a central human right, whereas in the West, we think of human rights very differently. And Sheena, I know that you had talked a little bit about alternative ways to view the success of China's Xinjiang policy. So I wonder if you could chime in on this question as well, of the potential costs of China's counterterrorism approach.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned earlier, I think there are, I see at least 3 different dimensions along which to think about success. The first is a sort of a tactical point, which is the one you hear most commonly from PRC officials, and that has to do with the short-term and immediate prevention of violent incidents in Xinjiang or elsewhere in China. So I think that's one potential metric. And again, like we talked about, that tends to be the one that gets a lot of emphasis and is used to argue for the success of the policy. But I think there are 2 other important points that would lead us to be a little more skeptical, at least right now, of the long-term success of China's efforts. And I haven't seen, honestly, within party-state discourse, an effort to openly grapple with this, and I'm not sure we will. One is actually a long-term issue of how an increasingly repressive or controlled political environment in Xinjiang is likely to affect long-term stability. We know from a lot of other work that's been done on non-democratic environments that in places where there's political pressure and high levels of political control, that citizens engage in, and sometimes lower level officials engage in, what's known as preference falsification. So a term that was coined in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to describe people having one set of internal beliefs or concerns and another set that they behave or put on in public that are politically acceptable and politically correct. And that what happens is sometimes that preference falsification can accumulate until a dam breaks, something happens like the Arab Spring or a cascade of protests like we've seen in other parts of the world. And suddenly it becomes clear that that dissatisfaction that was previously invisible is now much more visible and politically salient, and that leads to regime instability. And so preference falsification is really difficult to solve. There's been some sense that maybe you could use surveillance tools of one kind or another to try to detect it, but the reality is that this is sort of a fundamental political dynamic of highly controlled and repressive political environments. And so I think, even if you think about this in terms of a sort of domestic or internal security framework from the PRC standpoint, the question of time horizon is a really important one, and whether or not you are getting a short-term tactical success, but in the process accumulating long-term and concealed dissatisfaction that could eventually escalate. Now, the counter to that is that I think the party state has been quite careful about how it presents the terrorist threat. I think the messaging domestically about Xinjiang and about terrorism is quite strategic, in that I think we have to assume, again, in an environment where there's relatively high levels of media control, that there's some strategy to the information that the government chooses to release, and the timing and the type of information that's released. And the way I would characterize it, and there's some good work by others who've done some quantitative studies of Chinese media coverage of terrorism and incidents that are described as terrorism, suggesting that the party state wants to release enough information about the threat to get popular support among the majority of China's citizens for its policies in Xinjiang, right? Convincing them that the party state is actively protecting them against, in necessary ways, against a real threat, right? So you have to demonstrate that the threat is serious enough to justify the actions the government's taking and try to get some popular support. But on the other hand, not portray it as so acute that you erode confidence in the party state's ability to address that threat competently. And so, I think the information that we see released in domestic media is strategic, right? Information is strategically managed in any government, and the ability to manage and control and shape narratives is higher in an environment with higher media controls like China. And so I think, we also see an effort to engage in popular justification and to build up popular support among the majority in China for actions that are targeting a relatively small minority. So I just want to be clear that that's a counter perspective on this idea of widespread preference falsification. And ultimately that the distribution of preferences is unknowable, because we can't accurately measure people's opinion, and we have to think about, are we measuring opinion on this among all Chinese citizens or just people in Xinjiang? What is it that would matter for political stability? But those are two, that's a really important, I think, question. And then finally, let me just sort of finish with one point, which is that the idea, there's this term that's sometimes used for the kind of success that China might be experiencing. In the Soviet Union, there were times under sort of high levels of political control that was referred to as the peace of the prison yard, right? This is a historian of Eastern Europe talking about what the idea of peace means. And so I think it's important to note that, although the United States had some internal debate in the US government about whether or not the actions in Xinjiang constituted genocide, we've now seen two successive administrations of different party affiliations determine that it is. There was some internal debate on that within the State Department itself, but what was actually not debated was that China's behavior met the standard for crimes against humanity. The State Department had a unanimous recommendation to the secretary on that front. And I don't want us to sort of pass on, because there is some international debate and pushback on the use of the term genocide. I'm not an international legal scholar, so I'm not going to try to sort of wade into that. But I will say that the United States government has had no real debate over whether or not China's actions constitute crimes against humanity. And I think that's important to note, because that's the standard that's applied to places like North Korea and some other really important areas where the international community has expressed increasing concern. There's a lot of diplomatic politics beyond that we can come back to, but I know Yinsen had a comment, and I want to give her a chance to weigh in. Thanks.
Yes, go ahead, Yoon. I know you wanted to add.
Thank you, thank you. I was listening to the very two different narratives or two different perspectives coming to the same issue. So I definitely understand that how the Chinese are seeing this issue. They have a homegrown terrorism problem. And I think I would give credit to Beijing for trying different ways to test out the efficacy, for example, of the development-oriented approach. Back in 2010, 2011, after the July 5th riot in Urumqi, the Chinese government's first reaction is actually provide more assistance to Xinjiang. And there was also the partner program that where each county of Xinjiang is paired with a county or a city from the developed areas in the coastal side of China, in order to help the not so well developed or the backward regions in Xinjiang to achieve better economic development. But that policy was pretty much dropped when Chen Quanguo became the party secretary of Xinjiang. So I think for China, when Chen Quanguo was appointed to be the party secretary, Beijing felt that it had tried everything, and it was not able to solve this problem. So this high pressured approach, in the end, came as I would almost call it a last resort, given the political constraints that Beijing faces in terms of its how much liberty or how much democracy or democratic elements is allowed within that system. So I do not agree with the approach that Chen Quanguo has taken in Xinjiang, but I think we must recognize that terrorist attacks or terrorist activities since then has been put under control. Well, it does not equate to the end of terrorism in Xinjiang, because this is very temporary, and we don't know whether this is like a pressure cooker that now you put a really tight seal on the top, and now you could be just building the pressure within the space. So jury on that one is still out. But I think to argue that Beijing just without trying any other method and just decided to go for this high pressure approach, I think that's also a little unfair. But it does raise the question while I hear this discussion about the comments on China's counterterrorism efforts domestically. I have a question about the past dependence. That are we making this judgment about China because of its political system or because of the activities that it actually engages in? Because if it is because of a political system, then I don't think that there's much that Beijing can do to really change anything, because strategic messaging, all countries engage in strategic messaging and talking about the counterterrorism activities. Most countries also engage in those. So what I'm trying to say is that if our criticism of the legitimacy of the Chinese action is because of the nature of the Chinese regime, then I doubt we have a constructive solution ahead to because every problem in the end will be going back to, well, China doesn't have the legitimacy to rule Xinjiang as the way it is. So I think there is an interesting question of the past dependence there. And as for the human rights angle, I think it's also, there are a lot of duality in the diplomatic politics about human rights, because I think some of the US allies' actions or behaviors are also being criticized by the United States. But at the same time, I think the tolerance level for those actions are much higher, let's just say. So it's definitely a complicated issue. So instead of focus on the surface of the problem or on the activities or what we see, I think it will be interesting to look into the origins of what we perceive as China's wrongful or China's illegal counterterrorism approach, and where we could go with that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're running close to the end of time, so I want to address one more issue. A broader theme of this entire conference is looking at how the US approach to and the US definition of terrorism was adapted and replicated in countries across the world, but our focus particularly is on the Asia-Pacific. And I think a key question for us to consider here is, we've talked about the ways that China's approach to counterterrorism are unique. So is China trying to export its own model of counterterrorism, its own definition of terrorism and approach for handling it, or even, as Sheena pointed out, its broader national security model overseas? Is that something that China is interested in doing? And I know that Chinese officials often complain about, as you sort of touched on, the double standard regarding terrorism. So maybe Professor Wang, you can talk to us a little bit about, would China like to see changes in the way that the international community approaches counterterrorism? And if so, what changes would China like to see?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know what the government will do, but my own understanding is that China's experience and China's national condition is very unique. So its reproducibility is still need time to be proved. So just to give you an example, just now Sheena, Professor Sheena talked about the coast. Also, you mentioned that the United States counter-terror approach and China is totally different. When we talk about the coast, and as we all know that the United States counter-terror war in Afghanistan, and we have some discussion this afternoon. In Afghanistan, we cost more than 2.2 trillion US dollars, and more than I think about 170,000 people died in the war in Afghanistan. Is that had cost? So if we put the money for the infrastructure or help the other ethnic groups in domestic, perhaps we'll get a better result. For China, we put money to build the infrastructure in ethnic areas, we call the minority areas, just to help them. We call the poverty reduction. We think it's correct. But for China, I think we never believe, or we never think other countries could copy that, because the approach is very unique and the national condition is very unique. Just to give you one example, I think and Sheena used the genocide. I think it's a totally wrong words, because this is just the genocide is especially for some specific things, for Rwanda and other things, but in China we didn't kill anyone. And also the policy is just an intermediate policy, because as you know, in the 1980s, from 1980s, we have the birth control policy. This is not aimed or operated, carried on in the minority areas. In the whole country, all the country was carried on by with this policy. And we actually, the minorities, they have more opportunities than the Han majorities. For example, if a couple from Han ethnic groups, they could in the city they only have one child, but for the minorities they could have two. In the rural areas they could have three. But actually, if you go to if in Xinjiang, in some rural areas they may have three, they may have four, even seven, because they have a lot of children, and most of the children could not register. They could not register because was illegal. And if they could not be registered, they could not have land. And land is the most important thing for the farmers. But now the children grow up. They have no land. They have no education and no job. Of course, no job. So we have to do something to help them to find a job, to get some simple education. So this is what we're doing in the last few years. But there's nothing with the genocide. I don't want to use that word because I suggest you, if you have the opportunity, I suggest you to come and have a look, because the farmers will tell you everything. So I don't think the China's approach could be copied by other countries, and I don't think it's China's policy or interest to, how to say, to export China's experience, but we would like to share our experience with other people if they have the interest. The basic or the essence for China's approach is to develop, provides them more options, and makes them live a better life. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wang. Obviously, there is a very intense debate over what to call what is happening in Xinjiang, and as Sheena mentioned,
Of course,
yeah, this can get into a legal issue about what the definition of genocide is and whether it's being met in China is not something that I think any of us are equipped to answer. But clearly there's a divergence, and that's something we've discussed again over perceptions of to what extent China is violating human rights in Xinjiang versus protecting its citizens. I think that's the crux of this debate. But to go back to the international implications, Sheena, you have done a lot of research on China's national security model and how that's changed under Xi Jinping. So have you seen evidence that China is trying to make this into more of an international standard or be more widely accepted abroad? Or is this something that's mostly limited to domestic policy?
I very much see China's efforts as trying to ensure that it has freedom of action to handle counterterrorism and domestic security policy and foreign policy as it sees fit, and to normalize China's approach within the international community. So I see the diplomatic action and the set of letters that China has gathered at the United Nations in support of its approach to counterterrorism, again, very much as trying to position China's approach to counterterrorism as acceptable, normal, and legitimate within the international community and a diverse range of perspectives. Let me also just say that I think I'm a little puzzled by the objection to just noting the formal position of the United States government. The reality is that the position of the United States government on this has had a big impact on US-China relations. And so to simply note that that is formal US government policy at this point seems simply like just as we want to accurately characterize China's policy, we want to accurately characterize the policies of the United States government. I have been to Xinjiang, and I think it is important to note that China's policies on counterterrorism have been sort of what we would call whole spectrum policies. There's been a lot of work on economic development and poverty. And to Yunsun's point, that's actually why I find and why some of my work is focused on trying to explain why there was an escalation of detention and re-education in 2017, because that was a new and different approach than the poverty alleviation approach, than some of the infrastructure building approach, than some of the tools that that my co-panelists have noted. And it's that specific set of escalations that's produced the pushback from the United States and from the 40 odd countries that have indicated support for the US government policy at the UN. So if we're thinking about sort of the international politics of China's approach, that 2017 switch and that 2017 decision that was taken by the Central National Security Commission does seem to me to be pretty important and different. And it's that added layer of policy that's produced a lot of the international contestation that we've seen. Again, the approach and the success of this is sort of out for debate. The jury is out on how successful it'll be domestically in the United States, but I think it's also the story hasn't really been told yet on what the international impact will be. I'll sort of bracket, we're not really discussing US counterterrorism policy today. I know you've had separate panels on that, and I'll be talking more about Afghanistan at a panel here at UT tomorrow. So I'll avoid any sort of whataboutism or getting into questions about the US approach. Since we're focused on China today, I think it's just important to note that there's a very specific decision that was taken that's had both these domestic and international costs and consequences. And so the question is simply, it's our job as policy analysts to weight what those costs and benefits of that change in policy are at both the domestic and the international levels. And I very much agree that we haven't seen the end of this story at either the internal or the external and diplomatic level. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yoon, yeah, I'm sure you have some thoughts to add on this issue as well.
Sure, happy to share some very brief comments. Well, I definitely agree with Sheena. I think more deliberation is needed in this arena, and I think it's I actually think it is necessary to state what U.S. government policy is. I think it's also important to understand the dynamics or the diplomatic politics of that policy and the consequences of that policy. About what Professor Wang said about the minorities' preferential treatment in China. Well, I'm originally from China, and I am an ethnic minority. I'm actually Manchu, brown face, brown eyes. So I definitely understand that coming from a Chinese national or from a Han person perspective, that the minorities already receive a lot of preferential treatment, that you guys can have 2 children when we can have only 1. But I think that's a little bit of, well, putting in a bad word, there's a little bit of chauvinism involved in that statement. And to say the minimum, it is quite self-centered to say that, hey, well, we have this policy and you can have more than 1 children. Because the ethnic minorities might feel that overflow of population has never been a problem for the ethnic minorities. It's a Han problem. So the government, when it makes the one-child policy, it was imposed on ethnic minorities who didn't think that they have a population problem to begin with. So I think this well, given China's ethnic composition and the Han population occupies more than 95%, of course, it gets a majority view. But I think in this case, whether the ethnic minorities should be treated with the same criteria or put under the same policy imposition to begin with is an issue that deserves to be considered. And then, of course, I think there are also complaints from the Han population that, for example, the Tibetans have received more preferential policy and financial support from the central government. And I think the comparison between the treatment of the Tibetans and the reaction from Tibetans and also the treatment of Uyghurs merits a lot of interesting studies. Last, on the issue of China's export of the China model, I think there are 2 issues here. The first one is the appeal of the Chinese model of counterterrorism or domestic state security management and social management, because it does not appear appealing or attractive for United States at all. That this is completely, well, from a US perspective and from a democracy point of view, this is completely tyrannical, not only authoritarian, but borders draconian. So it does not have the appeal here in the Western democracies. But I think for countries, for example, in Africa or in Central Asia, less developed countries that have been plagued by the terrorism by terrorist issue, I think the Chinese model does have a lot of inspiring power. So it's not just a one-way street that China is trying to export its model. In fact, I think China is not really interested in exporting its model on counterterrorism, but instead it is the other countries that found the Chinese model to be effective. And therefore they come to China and asking for advice as for, well, how did China do this? And I think the issue of the digital authoritarianism is a sterling example at hand. That why is China exporting digital monitoring and surveillance systems and devices to African countries like Zimbabwe or countries like Kenya? So I think it's primarily because, well, there is a supply, that is true, but there also is a demand. So I think without offering, I guess, an alternative to what the Chinese model has to offer, I think we unfortunately will see that a lot of countries will find the Chinese way and the Chinese approach to be inspiring and attractive, and they want to mimic the Chinese experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoon. And thank you also, Sheena and Dr. Wong. I found this panel to be very enlightening, many different perspectives that are not often brought together in the same room. So I really appreciate that. If I could just wrap up with some closing observations, I want us to keep in mind that it is incredibly, incredibly difficult to eradicate the threat of terrorism. And that is something that we have seen proved the world over with all of these different models for how to tackle terrorism. No government has really figured it out. And the United States, Western Europe, we seem to have essentially decided that the cost of preventing every potential terrorist attack is too high. And if we put this another way, the occasional lone wolf terrorist attack is seen as an acceptable cost to pay for maintaining the level of freedom that we are accustomed to. And particularly if you broaden the definition of terrorism to include mass shootings, which are a frequent problem here in the United States, that's something that we as a society have essentially decided to bear that cost in exchange for our freedoms. In China, they've made a very different decision. And I think bringing this back to Yoon's point about path dependency, part of the issue for observers in the United States is that it is the Chinese government making this decision about what freedoms can be traded for safety. And the sense that the Chinese people are not able to provide feedback on that decision, are not able to discuss that decision and weigh in on that decision. And as Sheena has pointed out, we don't know what they would say. If every Chinese person was able to freely state their preferences, it could be that most of them agree with what the Chinese government is doing. But it could also be that some of them have concerns and would make a different choice. So those are just some of the issues that are at play here. And I'm so glad that we were able to unpack some of that in this discussion. We've already gone a little bit longer than the hour I promised. So thank you all for letting us expand our discussion. And thank you, the viewers at home, for joining us. We've hoped you enjoyed this inaugural conference to celebrate the launch of Diplomat Risk Intelligence. And we look forward to seeing you all back soon. Thank you.